riding with a friend through Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, past a stretch of Amish homesteads, and I made him slow the car down. The gardens were small, not modest, small. A couple of them would have fit inside my living room with space to spare, and I knew, because I'd been reading about these communities for years at that point, that those families were feeding 10, 12 people almost entirely from what they grew. I had a garden triple the size and couldn't make it through a week without a grocery run. Something was wrong with my understanding of how this works. I kept thinking about it on the drive home, and then for weeks after that, how do you pull more food from 100 square feet than someone else pulls from 300? And the answer turned out to be simpler than I expected, but it required me to unlearn almost everything I thought I knew about growing food. Today I'm going to walk you through the intensive growing methods that Amish families have developed and are refined over generations to get the most possible food out of the smallest possible space. And at the end, I'll share a 3-crop planting combination that produces more from 25 square feet than most gardeners expect from an entire raised bed. For most of my gardening life, I measured success by the size of my plot. A big garden meant I was serious, and I planted in wide rows with generous paths between them, and I walked those corridors feeling like I was doing things right. The problem, which I was genuinely slow to see, is that almost none of that space was producing food. The wide paths grew weeds, the bare soil between plants lost moisture and invited more weeds. I was maintaining ground that returned nothing. I was watering dirt. When I finally started paying close attention to how Amish gardeners think about their plots, I understood the mistake I'd been making for years. And their gardens had to produce, and these families depended on what they grew, and that pressure meant every method they used was tested against reality over many generations. What survived that testing was simple. It isn't the amount of space that determines your yield. It's what you do with the soil, how you time your plantings, and how densely you use what you have. And the philosophy behind all of it flows from a constraint. Amish gardeners work by hand, which means they design for maximum food per square foot rather than maximum convenience for machinery. Most of the row spacing printed on seed packets comes from commercial agriculture, where wide rows exist so a tractor can pass. Plants don't need that space. They need deep, fertile soil and just enough room for their mature size. Give them depth instead of width. Feed the ground seriously and keep something always growing. And a small bed will outproduce a large conventional garden nearly every time. The first step, and the one without which nothing else works properly, is deep soil preparation. Standard garden soil tends to be loose for about 6 to 8 inches, and then runs into a compacted layer that roots cannot penetrate. Amish intensive beds are prepared to 18 to 24 inches of loose, workable soil that roots can fully explore. The method is called double digging. It is real physical work, and I want to be honest about that. But you do it once per bed, and the results carry forward for years. Mark out your bed about 4 feet wide so you can reach the center from either side without ever stepping on the soil, because foot traffic is what undoes all of this. Start at one end and dig a trench 12 inches wide and 12 inches deep, setting that soil aside. Use a digging fork to break up the subsoil at the bottom of that trench, and another 10 to 12 inches deep without removing it. Then move to the next 12-inch section, dig the top layer and flip it into the first trench, break up the subsoil below, and continue down the entire bed. Fill the last trench with the soil you set aside at the beginning. The bed is now loose to roughly 2 feet. The change this creates in how plants grow is difficult to overstate. Instead of roots spreading sideways through the top, a few inches and competing with every neighbor, they go straight down into open soil. They find moisture and nutrients that shallow-rooted plants never reach, and they develop real drought resilience because they're drawing from deep reserves. And because the root zone goes down rather than out, you can space plants significantly closer without triggering competition. If any of this connects with something you've been trying to figure out in your own garden, I genuinely like to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me what your biggest space or yield frustration is. I read them and they directly influence what I make next. And that's not something I say as a formality. The second step is heavy composting, and I want to be specific about what heavy means here because it's more than most gardening advice recommends. Amish gardeners apply 4 to 6 inches of finished compost to their beds every year, worked into the top several inches of soil. This is not a light top dressing. It is a substantial annual investment that keeps the ground fertile enough to support plants growing just inches from one another. When plants are packed together, they draw from a small shared volume of soil. If that soil is merely average, they compete and underperform. When it is genuinely rich with organic matter, there is enough for all of them and they thrive. You do not need livestock to source this. Many municipalities offer free, finished compost from yard waste programs. Local farms frequently have aged manure. They are willing to part with. Building your own pile is entirely achievable and produces something better than most of what you can buy. The core shift is treating compost not as an occasional amendment, but as the structural foundation of your growing system. The deep soil and the organic matter together create the conditions that make everything that follows possible. Without that foundation, close spacing and timed planting will disappoint. And with it, those techniques become remarkably productive. The third step is the close spacing itself, which looks alarming to most conventionally trained gardeners, but is the direct result of the foundation work that came before. Forget the spacings on seed packets. Those numbers were designed for tractors, and the Amish principle is simple. Plant close enough that the mature leaves of neighboring plants will just touch, forming a continuous canopy over the soil surface. For lettuce and salad greens, that means 4 to 6 inches in every direction, not in rows with open paths. For cabbage and broccoli, 12 to 18 inches. Tomatoes, 18 to 24 inches on vertical stakes. Beans, 4 inches apart on a trellis. And when plant canopy covers the soil completely, weeds cannot germinate because the light they need never reaches the ground. Moisture stays in the soil because the sun never hits it directly. Soil temperature stays stable, which roots strongly prefer. And every inch of the bed is producing food rather than sitting idle. This spacing will fail in average soil, and that failure is not a mystery. The deep preparation and heavy composting are not preliminary steps. They are what make the system work. But when they are done properly, a single 4 by 25 foot bed can produce as much food as a conventional garden, several times its size. The fourth step is succession, planting, and I believe this is the single technique that most home gardeners leave the most yield on the table by ignoring. The typical approach is to plant everything in one weekend in spring. All the lettuce goes in at once, all the beans, all the carrots. Everything matures at the same time. You're drowning in lettuce for 2 weeks, and then you have none for the rest of the season. The feast and famine cycle feels inevitable, but it's entirely a product of how you plant rather than some fixed feature of how gardens work. Amish gardeners plant in small, staggered batches every 2 to 3 weeks throughout the season. Instead of 20 row feet of lettuce all at once, you plant 5 feet this week, and another 5 2 weeks from now, and another 5 2 weeks after that. And by the time your first planting is spent, the second is ready to harvest, and the third is coming up behind it. You are never overwhelmed and never without. The same principle applies to beans, carrots, radishes, beets, and any crop that doesn't require the full season to mature. In concrete terms, this looks like the following. 6 weeks before your last frost, put in your first succession of cold-tolerant crops: lettuce, spinach, radishes, peas. 3 weeks later, a second round of the same crops in a different section. 3 weeks after that, a third. By the time you're seeding that third round, your first radishes are ready to pull, and the space they occupied opens up for warm season transplants. Tomatoes and peppers move into those gaps. Quick crops continue cycling into any space that opens throughout the season. Amish families often keep a simple notebook tracking what went in, where, and when, so they always know when to start the next round. The payoff for that small discipline is a continuous harvest from late. spring through the first frost. 100 square feet managed this way can provide all the salad greens, beans, and cooking vegetables a small family needs across the full growing season. And that is not a dramatic claim. It is what thoughtful timing produces. If you've been finding this useful and you've been here the whole time, please subscribe. I don't say that as a reflex at the end of every section. I say it because I put genuine effort into these videos, and knowing that people are finding them worthwhile is actually the reason I keep making them. That's the full, honest version of that ask. The fifth step combines two techniques that multiply your effective growing space by capturing what conventional gardening habitually wastes. The first is interplanting, growing two crops in the same ground simultaneously by pairing varieties that don't compete because they mature on different timelines or use different layers of the soil. Radishes and carrots are the clearest example. Radishes are done in 30 days. Carrots take 70 to 80. Plant them together in the same row, and the radishes germinate fast, mark the planting line, and are harvested and gone well before the carrots need that space. Two full crops, one row, no competition at any point. Another pairing that works beautifully is lettuce beneath tomato plants. In early spring, the lettuce grows in full sun. By the time summer heat arrives and the lettuce starts to bolt, the tomatoes above it have leafed out enough to shade the ground anyway. The lettuce finishes its season in space that would otherwise be bare soil under a tomato cage. Amish gardeners look constantly for these pairings, quick crops alongside slow ones. Shallow-rooted plants beside deep-rooted ones, cool season harvests in spaces that warm season plants will fill later. Every inch is evaluated for how it can be made to produce something more. The second half of this step is vertical growing. A cucumber plant allowed to run across the ground claims 15 to 20 square feet of bed space, trained up a simple trellis, and that same plant occupies about 2 square feet of ground, while producing the same harvest or better. In a 100 square foot intensive bed, that is not a small difference. It is the difference between a cucumber patch and a diverse bed producing 5 or 6 different crops. Trellis your cucumbers at the north end of the bed where they won't shade everything else. Reclaim that ground for beets, carrots, lettuce, and beans. Pole beans are especially well suited to this. A teepee of poles or a simple string trellis sends the harvest up to chest height, and the shade at the base supports a full planting of lettuce or spinach that would otherwise have nowhere productive to go. Now let me share the combination I mentioned at the beginning. Amish families adapted the Native American Three Sisters planting for intensive beds, and it is one of the most satisfying things I grow every year. Plant corn in a block rather than rows, stalks about 12 inches apart in all directions. A 4x4 block of 16 stalks takes roughly 16 square feet. Once the corn reaches 6 inches tall, plant pole beans at the base of each stalk. The beans climb the corn, eliminating the need for separate trellising, and they fix nitrogen in the soil as they grow, feeding both the corn and the surrounding ground. Around the outside of that corn block, plant winter squash or pumpkins. Their vines run outward, away from the center, and their broad leaves shade the surrounding soil, suppressing weeds and holding moisture across the whole planting. In about 25 square feet, 3 crops are growing simultaneously, each supporting the others. The corn structures the beans, and the beans fertilize the corn and squash. The squash mulches the whole system. It requires well-prepared soil and consistent water to perform at its best. And both of those things are exactly what the foundation steps in this video build. When all of it is in place, the Three Sisters is genuinely one of the most productive and personally satisfying configurations I've ever grown. What Amish intensive gardening taught me in the end is that size has almost nothing to do with what a garden produces. The families I drove past in Lancaster County weren't getting by on small plots despite their size. They were maximizing those plots because the constraints they lived with forced them to understand what actually drives yield: depth, fertility, timing, and how cleverly you use the space you have. I spent years proud of a garden that was mostly wasted ground. Learning these methods was humbling in the best possible way. If you're trying any of this season, come back and tell me how it goes. Tell me what surprised you, what didn't work the way you expected, what you'd do differently. That kind of conversation is the real reason I make these videos, and I mean that more than any other thing I've said today. I'll see you in the next one.